So I'd like to welcome you to day 3 of our winter session program. And the overarching theme is campus and environmental politics. And this first session is entitled Understanding the Dynamics of Campus Politics. So although universities and colleges have long been considered sites for open inquiry and the free exchange of ideas, the wave of controversy that has swept the American academy in recent years contradicts this belief. In this book talk, Dr. Zimmerman, whom I'm going to introduce shortly, unpacks the history, causes, and manifestations of this contemporary political development on campuses, analyzing the implications of the goals of social justice such as political correctness, affirmative action, speech policing, in-loco parentis administration, trigger warnings and safe spaces on academic freedom and free speech. So I'm excited this morning to introduce my good friend, Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, who is a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school social studies teacher, Dr. Zimmerman is the author of The Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America, which is forthcoming from Johns Hopkins University Press in October, and 7 other books, including the one that you have, and that hopefully you have read. He's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, and other popular periodicals. Before coming to Penn in 2016, Dr. Zimmerman taught at New York University for 20 years. In 2008, he received NYU's Distinguished Teaching Award, its highest recognition for teaching. Dr. Zimmerman is also the author of your assigned text, as I mentioned, which is entitled Campus Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. Help me welcome Dr. Zimmerman.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, he forgot the part where I cured cancer. Yeah, you know, I'm quite astonished and gratified that Wellesley actually assigned my book to you. You may become the first people that are not blood relatives to read that book. Although we could be related as well, because Americans often are and don't like to talk about that. The very first book that I wrote, being a younger man, quite green in judgment, somebody gave me this Publishers Clearinghouse number, this 800 number, where you could call and allegedly track the sales of the book. And so again, being a naif, a younger man, I dialed it and I got the computer voice, right? And it said, you know, I put in my IBSN number, like the publisher number, and I listened, and the computer voice said, "Good morning. You have sold 0 books today." And that wasn't getting me any closer to God, so I haven't done it since. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me up here, and even for reading my book, and thanks especially to Shingi for organizing all of this. I'm old-fashioned enough to actually believe that the humanities is supposed to make us better people, more welcoming, more empathetic, more aware people. And Shingi, to me, is the sort of person that actually embodies that. And I'm delighted that he's here with all of you. That being said, all that other nice stuff, I have to tell you that my talk is a bummer. It's just a bummer. Here's what I'm going to try to persuade you of. We're at a moment of intense, possibly unparalleled political polarization in this country. That's the boring part. I mean, when I say boring, it won't surprise you, you know, and we can illustrate it in any number of different ways, including what's happening right now, even as we speak, in the United States Senate. Then, more to our issue, that this is an educational problem. It's not just a political one. It's a huge challenge for us as universities and colleges, as educators, and we have not risen to that challenge. We haven't risen to the challenge that America's presented to us. In some ways, we've made things worse. And so I don't make everything a bummer. I will conclude with some modest suggestions about how we might be able to make things better. Believe it or not, I'm actually a very optimistic person, but it's hard for me at this moment to retain that. because all of us have to ask ourselves, what have we as members of university communities done to enhance our democracy? And I think the answer is A, not enough, and B, sometimes we've made it worse. We hear a lot in the news about how Russians tried to undermine our democracy. We hear a lot in the news about how the President of the United States has undermined our democracy. And I believe in both of those things very strongly. But I don't think that the rest of us have risen to the challenge that those things present to us. So very briefly, the polarization part, you cannot blame it all on he who shall not be named. All right, he is the president, and certainly he's ginned things up. But polarization is all around us. It preceded Donald Trump, and in many ways, he's as much a product of it as an engine of it. You can measure it in a zillion different ways, but just to give you a sense, in the mid-70s, when I was in high school, a quarter of Americans lived in landslide counties. A landslide county is a county where the difference between Democrat and Republican is more than 20%. By 2008, 60% did. That's amazing, from 20% to 60%. Over that time, from when I was in high school to now, you become half as likely to live next to somebody of a different political party. You become half as likely to have a friend of a different political party, half as likely to date somebody of a different political party, half as likely to marry somebody of a different political party. The political scientists have done this like all kinds of different ways. Like if you're in a community where there's a Whole Foods, it's 80-20 Democrat-Republican. If you're in a community where there's a Cracker Barrel, it's 80-20 Republican-Democrat. Isn't that amazing? I mean, we have made ourselves into ideological cocoons. That's really what we've done. And here, friends, is the most depressing part of all. The more education you have, the less likely you are to report having a conversation with somebody of a different political party. This, to me, is the ultimate indictment of higher education. What that statistic tells me is that higher education is doing exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to do. Higher education is supposed to expose us to things that are not us. All right? That's what the humanities are supposed to do. But in fact, the political science literature suggests, in fact, proves that it's the opposite. So the more education you have, the less likely you are to report talking, conversing, even knowing somebody of a different political party. Again, it's gotten worse because of him, and I'm not going to bore you with all the incredible ways he's made it worse. Threatening judges and reporters, calling them enemies of the people, calling his opponents, losers and dummies, and just echoing the snark of reality TV, which is where he came from. I yield to nobody in my loathing of the person that we made president. Nobody, and I won't defend it or apologize for it. Okay? But here's the thing. He is the president, and he's the greatest threat to our democracy because he's the president. And the second greatest threat? The rest of us imitating him. That's the second greatest threat, and it's all around us. All right, so the rest of us, those of us who are his opponents, we call same-sex marriage opponents homophobes. We call Trump voters white supremacists. Some of them are, of course, but certainly not all. All right, we call people white-splainers and mansplainers and racists and sexists and homophobes and transphobes. All Trumpian. Why is it Trumpian? Because it's substituting name-calling for argument, and it's dismissing people you disagree with as just vile and beyond the pale and inhuman. All those words are ways to denigrate other people, which again is what he does. And again, I make no apologies and I make no bones about my disdain for Trump. But let me be more clear about where that disdain is. It's not because of his political positions. I don't share almost all of them. okay? But that's not why I disdain Trump. Why? Because I think all those political positions are arguable. When I say arguable, I mean that reasonable and decent people can disagree about that. About healthcare, about taxes, about immigration, all right? But reasonable and decent people don't call a continent a shithole. They don't call women pigs. They don't call reporters enemies of the people. They just don't. So I've been going around to institutions all over this country giving talks about teaching in Trump. And basically my message is, in a nutshell, any of your students can like Trump, any of you can like Trump. That is totally and 100% fine by me. I would lay down everything for your right to like Trump. You just can't act like him. Oh no, not on my watch. You can like him, you can't act like him. And that's what we're all doing. Going into his vortex, descending into his place, where the people who disagree with you aren't just reasonable people that disagree with you, but again, are inhuman ogres, all right? Pariahs, beyond the human pale. So what have we as colleges and universities done about that? The answer is not enough and almost nothing. I think this program that Shingy and the others are directing, including Dr. Litch, is totally fabulous, and I think it's an outlier. All right? I think it's the exception that proves the rule. For the most part, this is not what happens. What happens, again, is that mutual vilification, all right? That lack of real discussion and tolerance. Why is that? There are a million reasons, but the first is that at the four-year schools, the faculty is overwhelmingly people like me. I'm a left-leaning Democrat, and so are the vast majority of everybody that I work with. And it's so funny because sometimes I'll give this talk and people will say, oh, what about the econ department? Well, I looked that up, Obama-McCain, Obama-Romney, 75% of economists supported Obama. I'm like, dude, that's the best you could do? That's like your Republican liberal arts? Like, please. Anthro, by the way, 97 to 3. Yeah, 97% to 3%, Obama-Romney. And who is that 3% of Republican anthropologists? Like, my heart goes out to them wherever they are. So obviously that's part of the problem. And again, I say that as somebody who is part of the problem. Something we don't talk near enough about, the low overall status and quality of teaching in higher education. Look, you go to Wellesley, all right? The teaching, the average quality of teaching at Wellesley is so vastly superior to what most American college students receive. So when you survey American college students and you ask them questions like, have you engaged in discussion in the classroom about controversial political questions? Most of them say no. Most of them say actually they haven't participated in class at all. Yeah, all right? And sometimes that's because there are 300 other people in the class, which is something else you don't experience at Wellesley. So if they're not learning and practicing how to do that in a classroom, should we really be surprised that they can't or don't do it in the public sphere? I don't think so. I think it makes total and sad sense. Let's also remember, and this is, again, shows you how different Wellesley is, a huge amount of instruction now happens online, which does not lend itself to respectful dialogue, if you haven't noticed. Screw you! No, screw you! Yeah, right? Name call, name call, name call. Right? Cancel, cancel, cancel. So, that's part of the problem, but it gets worse. And this is one of the themes of my book. I think at the university we've embraced and even furthered a larger cultural shift, which is what in the book I call the psychologizing politics. And what that is it's the freezing of political claims in psychological terms. So it's not that you're wrong, it's that you've microaggressed me, you've triggered me, you've harmed me. All right? Now let me be clear about this. I'm not against psychology. My family and I have been great beneficiaries of psychology. I'll save you the details. All right? It's not that I'm against psychology. It's that I don't think psychology and politics play well with each other. If you tell me that in this talk you were microaggressed or triggered by something that I said, which you may have been, I have exactly one thing to say in reply. Sorry. And I mean it, right? I don't want to offend or insult any of you. All I could say is sorry, that's it. Maybe I could ask you a little bit more about why you were microaggressed or triggered, but what I couldn't say is you weren't. I can't look into your soul. When I give this rap, often my students will say, "You're denying our feelings." Oh no. Oh no. It's the opposite. It's precisely the undeniability of your feelings that make them such a poor venue for political discussion. It's because I can't deny them. Political discussion requires a kind of denial, right? No, you're wrong for the following reasons, right? No, I think that's an error because of X. How can I do that about your feelings? How can I say that you were wrong about your feelings? I can't, right? They're yours. If you do a deep dive into microaggressions, like I did in the book, what you find is that the term was coined by a psychiatrist at Harvard, which is, I don't know if you've heard of that, it's close to here, in 1970. But nobody paid it any mind. This is the sort of thing that historians are obsessed with. It's kind of the history and genealogy of terms, when they become salient. Like, this guy coined it in 1970, but I had never heard the term microaggression until about 2010. That's because a couple other people revived it, right? Like, found it and rejuvenated it. And the key figure is a guy at Teachers College whose name is Gerald Wing Sue. What he started to do was to promulgate these lists of microaggressions. And just to give you a sense of what Sue thinks, and microaggressions, again, subtle, indirect comments, often unintended, okay, that are nevertheless harmful to the person receiving them, okay? And I quote this in the book because I was astonished when I found it. Sue wrote, "It's not the white supremacist KKK members or skinheads who pose the greatest threat to people of color, but instead well-intentioned people, strongly motivated by egalitarian values, who see themselves as fair-minded and decent people who would never discriminate against anybody." So microaggressions are the racism that knows not its name. And they come in two varieties. They come in ones that enhance or exaggerate your distinctiveness, and ones that erase it. That's what's so interesting with microaggressions. So, Asians are good at math. This is a microaggression because it highlights an alleged difference on the part of the person on the receiving end. But when I see you, I don't see color. That's a microaggression too, not because it highlights the distinctiveness of the person, but because it erases it. There's only one race, the human race. America's a melting pot. These are all things Gerald Wing Sue lists as microaggressions, bad things to say, because in those cases, it allegedly erases difference. Where are you from is a microaggression, and I asked some of you that today, and I apologize if you were offended. That's a microaggression because allegedly it highlights difference. Okay, America's a melting pot's a microaggression because it takes it away. You might have caught this in my book, but even discussions of microaggressions can be microaggressive. So at Brandeis, which is also down the road, a few years ago, the Brandeis Asian American Society created a public artwork about microaggressions, featuring examples straight from the Gerald Wing Sue playbook. Asians are good at math, I don't see race. But then other Asians denounced the exhibit as microaggressive. The people that put it up did a big mea culpa, and one of them went on to social media and said, "I'm sorry to anyone who was triggered, hurt, or microaggressed by the artwork about microaggression." Look, I think any of these comments can be insulting, depending on who's talking and who's listening, depending on the context. All right? I can imagine any number of reasons why they might be insulting. What I object to is the idea of a university or college that's devoted to knowledge taking a normative stance on a contested issue of arts and letters, like the melting pot. I mean, friends, the whole question of assimilation is one of the most contested questions in America, in American history, all right? The whole idea of a university saying, oh no, we're weighing in against that. To me, that contradicts what a university is for. Trigger warnings, incidentally, they have a totally different genealogy, super interesting, comes not from like a dweeby Harvard academic, but from the feminist blogosphere in the 1990s. When people started to get online, feminists started to realize there was a lot of awful content online, and they devised these trigger warnings for content that had sexual violence in it. On the utterly reasonable idea that somebody that had been a victim of sexual violence might be deeply troubled when they encounter this online. And that seems utterly reasonable to me. Look, at NYU I taught a big lecture course on the culture wars in American history, and we did a segment about pornography and the regulation of pornography. And I would sometimes show a film by an NYU colleague called The Price of Pleasure, which is an anti-porn movie. But in the course of trying to make the argument against pornography, it shows like some really awful, violent and misogynist porn clips. And so what I would do is, the day before the film, I would just describe in English what happens in those clips. And I would say, listen, if you don't want to watch those, don't come during the following times of class. I didn't call that a trigger warning, but for all practical purposes, I think it was. That seems reasonable to me. Here's what isn't reasonable, all right? There have been demands on college campuses for trigger warnings for any material about pregnancy, about addiction, about bullying, about suicide, and about Downton Abbey. Because if you've seen Downton Abbey, like bad shit happens in Downton Abbey. Like all that stuff I just referenced happens in Downton Abbey. And my favorite example, a student in in a class about horror movies, demanding a trigger warning before bloody movie scenes. Dude, it's a class about horror movies, and it's an elective. If you weren't into bloody movie scenes, which is totally cool, maybe you shouldn't have elected to take a class about horror movies. But look, like the jester says to King Lear, this is not altogether fool, my lord. This isn't just a joke. This is serious, and here's why I think it's serious. The language of psychology teaches us to feel a certain way. It establishes feeling rules. Feeling rules, coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild like 40 years ago, are the social scripts around us that influence without determining what we feel. So here's the way it works. Feeling is subjective. Everybody feels what they feel, like I said before. But nevertheless, we live in social communities, all right? And there are scripts around us that influence without determining what we feel. I think the language of psychology is actually promoting precisely the feelings that it says it's interdicting. All right? It's encouraging us and teaching us to feel injured. All right? There is no body of psychology that I've read that tells me this is a good idea. If you went to your therapist and you described a bunch of problems and your therapist sat you down and said, you were injured, you were injured, you were injured, you would have good reason to sue your therapist, because that's not going to help you. But I realized this during this contretemps that happened again at that place called Harvard like 5 years ago, where somebody broke into the law school and defaced the portraits of the faculty of color by putting masking tape over their mouths on portraits. And this created this massive, massive imbroglio, all sorts of demonstrators outside, and mostly students, often students of color, saying that they had been harmed by this. They had been injured by this. Well, Randy Kennedy, who teaches at Harvard Law School, is himself African American and had one of his portrait was indeed defaced. He wrote an op-ed the next day making 2 points, all right? First of all, this is the duh one. How do we know this was a racist act? It certainly could have been, but they never found out who did it. And it's certainly plausible that somebody was doing it like as a piece of performance art, right? To talk about like the muzzled voices of the faculty of color, right? But to immediately go to that, right? That this was a racist act. And man, let me be clear, it could well have been, right? But the point is we don't know, but we're teaching people to assume that it was, all right? And then the more interesting point he made was, how do we help people by having, like they did, staking counseling sessions, all right, after an event like that? And I'm just going to use his word. He says, aren't we going to teach the students a sense of victimization? How will we help them by teaching them to be offended? So if we hold counseling sessions for the trauma that people experienced after that event, aren't we actually teaching them to feel traumatized? And don't get me started on trauma. I mean, look, I'm married to a physician. Trauma is real. Trauma exists. But we're going to empty its meaning if we call everything we don't like trauma. Somebody who was traumatized by what I just described, right, by the defacing of those portraits, I would like them to go with a straight face to a Syrian refugee center or a battered women's shelter and say to the people there, you know, I can identify with you because I was traumatized also. Like by this defacing of this portrait. What do we do to that term when we call everything that offends us trauma, right? That's like calling everything a lynching. You know, Clarence Thomas, when, you know, he was, nominated to be in the Supreme Court and all that stuff with, Anita Hill, he famously said, you know, this is a high-tech lynching. And often my students will call things they don't like lynching. And what I always say is, look, if you think that this, whatever it is, this defacing the portrait, whatever it is, a lynching, you gotta read more about lynching. Like whatever you're talking about, I'm sure it sucked in a million ways. But it's not lynching. And if you think it's lynching, you don't know enough about lynching. Read up about lynching. Once we start calling everything a lynching, what we're going to do is erode the meaning and indeed the history of the term. All right? But what are institutions doing to challenge the polarization that's all around us? The answer is almost nothing. All the terms I'm describing, all the activities I'm describing actually ramp up the polarization. Offering comfort to traumatized students after Hillary lost. And believe it or not, she went to Wellesley. I'm sure you don't know that. Creating trauma centers in the wake of events like that. What's the upshot? What happens? Well, you know what happens? Instead of having discussion, people stop talking. All right? And I had some of these statistics in my book, and the others that have been collected since then are even more distressing, at least to me. Basically, friends, what we find is that faculty members and students are biting their tongues. Why? Because they don't want to be on the other end of somebody who says that they were injured by the speech. Okay? So you look at college students, freshman to senior year, and you ask them the same question. Do you feel comfortable expressing what you think in class? Each year they're in class, that is freshman to senior year, fewer students say they feel comfortable expressing what they think in class. Again, that's an enormous indictment of us. How could that be good, right? It seems to me that's incredibly bad news. On the faculty side, even though there's academic freedom for some faculty members also are biting their tongue. So let me just give you one example, which also appears in the book. I was amazed when I was researching the book to discover that almost 40% of full-time faculty oppose the use of race in college admissions. I should be honest with you because I try to be transparent in everything. I support that. I'm a big advocate for affirmative action. I always have been. Why was I upset that 40% of my colleagues are on the other side? Not because they're on the other side. I was upset because I'm not hearing them. Like, where are they? All right? They're not talking. And friends, that cannot be good. That can't be good for the university. That can't even be good for affirmative action. I'll say this, as a supporter of affirmative action, that distresses me. Because I believe affirmative action will only flourish if we can have a full and complete discussion about it. And we are not having that, right? Because people are afraid. It is not enough just to bring together people from diverse backgrounds, all right? I want that, but that's just a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient one, all right? Just because you bring in people from all over the country or all over the world doesn't mean they're actually going to converse with each other. Not in a meaningful way. I think what we need to do is we need to engage them in speaking across their differences, which is, I think, what this fellowship program is supposed to do. So you may have read at Colorado Springs, which has both Colorado College and the Air Force Academy, right? Two very different institutions, different histories, different profiles. What they've been doing is they've been bringing students from those two institutions together to have structured conversations. And I did this at Penn. I was so distressed after the elections. I was distressed that Trump won, but I was distressed at how little discussion there was, real discussion about the election, real discussion. That what I did was I partnered with Cairn University, formerly Philadelphia Bible College. And what we did is we took a bunch of Penn students out there one night, and then 2 weeks later we brought kids from Philadelphia Bible College to Penn. And the way we do it, if you're interested, is we have wedding tables, as we call them, and everybody gets a table number when they come in, just like you would at a wedding. And we stagger the tables like Penn and Cairn. And the first time we did it, it didn't work because we just said talk among yourselves, and of course they didn't know how. So what we do is, we up on the dais, we have 2 Penn students and 2 Cairn students that we've chosen carefully beforehand. And what we do is we'll ask them a question at the beginning, and they talk in front of everybody else to say, who did you vote for and why? And they start talking, and after 5 minutes we say, stop, and then we say the tables, talk amongst yourselves. And once they've actually seen that, it really works. You know, and we did post hoc interviews, and a lot of the Penn students said, like, I had never met somebody that voted for Trump. I had never met an evangelical Christian. And, like, I met this Trump voter, and he wasn't a bad guy. Like, he didn't have fangs, and we mostly talked about the Eagles. But of course, that's what's not happening. That's what we need to make happen, and it is a heavy lift. I've been going around the country to schools and colleges making a plea for this. And it's hard because we're so angry and we're so scared. And look, I'm angry and scared as well. I'm a part of this too. I'm terrified at what's happened to the country that I love. And I'm appalled at the leader of our country and the way that he's behaved. And yet, and I'm going to come to a close because I want to hear from you, which is more important to me. I have been struck as I go around the country at how many people like you, like this, are trying to find ways to talk. Are trying to find ways to work our way through this moment. And I'm developing kind of a checklist that I advise people on for engaging in these conversations, especially teachers. So what is it? Distinguish fact from opinion, like real controversy from fake controversy. Pat Moynihan said everyone's entitled to their own opinions, they're not entitled to their own facts. And we, all of us, have to be rigid about this. So, would I debate with you whether human behavior has warmed the earth? I would not. I understand that there are millions of Americans who say that it hasn't. they're wrong. A real controversy is one where the most informed people have some sort of disagreement. And there is no disagreement on that. What we should do about it, whether we should be in the Paris Accord, whether we should be in the Kyoto Accord, whether we should have higher gas taxes, whatever it is, all that is up for grabs. But whether human beings have warmed the climate is not. Let's take another example. Do human beings share DNA with other creatures? I understand that there are millions of Americans who answer that question, no. I believe they have the right to that belief. I believe they should say it as loud as they want, and I would lay down everything for their right to do that. But we, as educators, shouldn't debate that question in our schools or our universities. It is a fake controversy. Do vaccines cause autism? The answer to that question is no. Now, how vaccines should be distributed, even whether they should be required by schools, that's all up for grabs, right? Because there are informed people that disagree about that question, all right? Whether vaccines cause autism, there are none. There are no informed people, right? The best informed people do not believe that. So that's one thing, distinguishing fact from opinion. Avoiding indoctrination. What's indoctrination? It's when I say you've got to agree with me. So look, I've been very clear about my views in this talk, but you are not enjoined to share them. And frankly, I think that often you learn more when you don't. All right? That's what teachers at every level have to make clear. They're political actors. They don't live in some Olympian neutral zone. Okay? They have views and politics and biases. All right? And free speech. They can, and I think often do, and maybe even should, share what they think, but they have to make it clear that the people in their charge, i.e. their students, don't have to, aren't required to. And then the most important thing is enforcing rules of civility. So again, you can support Trump, but you can't act like him. So no teacher, no parent would allow the young people in their charge to behave like Trump, to name call and denigrate. All right? Don't be like him. Don't be like him! Don't be like him! I just keep saying that over and over again, you know? And like people in the resistance, right? I'm like, isn't it a ridiculous way to resist him, to act like him? Aren't you capitulating to him? So what do the rest of us do who aren't teachers? How do we do this? How can we do this? We're only going to get the schools and universities that we deserve. They're only going to be as good as we are. How do we make ourselves better? Here are just a couple things I'm going to throw out, and then I'll stop talking. Friends, whatever you do, please, please try to expose yourself to views that aren't yours. Try to inform yourself about the other side. How do I do this? Well, I go to the gym every day, and I only watch Fox News. An exclusive diet of Fox News. It's not always easy for me, all right? And some of the Republican bros in the gym think I'm like a Republican bro because they see what's on my screen, and they'll like walk by me and be like, Hillary's email server, or like whatever thing is on there. I'm like, you know? But here's what happens, friends. Either I hear something ridiculous or offensive and I just kind of go faster, right, gritting my teeth, or I actually learned something I didn't know. It turns out that like all prejudices, my prejudice against Fox News was based in ignorance, right? All prejudices are. That's why it's called prejudge. So like, is there ridiculous stuff on Fox News? Are there like straight up a pair of cheeks for Trump like Sean Hannity on Fox News? Yes. But if you watch it during the day, it turns out that like there are people of color on Fox News. There are Democrats on Fox News. Like Fox News is a diverse nation. Like who knew? I didn't, because my team was just like faux news, Fox News, like boo, right? And so I just bought that hook, line, sinker because I'd never seen it. Because why would I? Because we all know it's bad, right? It's Fox News. All right, so please expose yourself. Like, don't just look at your feed. What could be a worse metaphor than that? Your feed. Time for more politics, curated to all your biases, right? It's time for your 9 o'clock feed, right? And it's fun too, right? It lights up all the pleasure centers, right? I hate Trump also. Right? And it makes you feel good, it makes you feel superior, right? And there's a lot of evidence supporting this, right? I mean, what I'm pleading for is something that is unnatural. It's much more natural just to hate the other team and fun, right? When you do engage with somebody of a different viewpoint, like a Trump voter, use the right question. And the right question is not, how can you vote for that idiot? That is not the right question. It's not a question at all, right? What it indicates is you're already settled on the answer. So it's just simple. So, it's funny. I mean, I haven't met many people who are voting for Trump. Why'd you vote for him? People tell you. But if you just say, you voted for that idiot, why? They're not going to. All right? You're not going to learn anything. Avoid name calling and mutual stigmatization. Again, because that's what he does, right? You know, you're a libtard, you're a wingnut, you want faux news. What does that get you besides that like sense of moral superiority and frisson? Like, it gets you nothing. It gets us nothing. Don't be afraid of emotion, but don't mistake emotion for argument. Friends, there's nothing wrong with emotion, just like there's nothing wrong with psychology. I'm very emotional about these questions. In fact, I would suggest that if right now in America you're not emotional about something, you might be a sociopath. All right? I'm not against emotion, but here's the important point. The depth of your emotion is not an indice of the strength of your argument. Okay? Terrible, terrible people have thought awful things and felt them very deeply. Okay, there's people marching in Charlottesville, you know, Jews will not replace us and all that. They were feeling it, right? They had very strong emotions, all right? But the strength of their emotions doesn't speak to the validity, the strength of their argument. Don't mistake emotion for argument. And then finally, support institutions like this. They're trying to do this work. They're trying to teach us a better way of talking, a better way than we see on the media. I mean, look, when I was a kid, there were 3 channels. You've heard us graybeards going about this, right? There were 3 channels, right? Now there are 900 and nothing's on, right? But the point is there are 900 and you can just choose the one, right, that's curated for you, okay, and not get exposed to anything else. The other thing you'll see, when they do have, like, debates, they're not debates. Like, Susan and I will be watching TV, and they'll say, okay, after the break we have a debate on healthcare, or whatever, and 4 talking heads come out, and they just rant at each other. They just rant. And we look at each other and we're like, that wasn't a debate. Friends, that's what Americans are going to think politics is. Unless we educators, we students, we teachers, teach a better way of doing it. That's what Americans are going to think politics is. So support the institutions that do it. They want to do it. All right? And I learned this. I went to a Mennonite school in rural Pennsylvania. And the Mennonites are fascinating because the Orthodox ones, check this out, they're pacifists and they're against marriage equality. Which is super interesting, because I guarantee you, if you went to Harvard Square and you found somebody who called themselves a pacifist, I will bet my now totally depleted 2 daughters through school lifetime earnings that they support marriage equality. But the Mennonites are different, and they wanted me to go in and talk about how to talk about that, right? About same-sex marriage. And so I did. I gave some suggestions, and at the end I said we should also thank Ms. whatever her name is, the person who invited me, for having this discussion. And she stood up and everybody clapped, and I looked at her and she was bawling. And it was just an amazingly powerful moment for me, because it reminded me how hard all this is, but also like how there is this wellspring for it. Like, we know we can be better than this. We do, right? We just haven't found a way to do this. Look, democracy isn't just government. It's not a system of government. It's a system of faith. All right? We've got to believe that people of equal reason and decency can and do reason to different conclusions. We need schools and universities to teach them how to do it. And it is a hard lift. My father died a year and a half ago, and the last conversation I had with him was about this, believe it or not, because I was telling him about these talks I was giving, and he said, you know, how are we ever going to find a way to talk to each other? And he died a few hours later. And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm really grateful for my dad and for you for asking. Thanks a lot. So please, questions. As always, I went on way too long. And please understand that any question is a good question. The only bad question is the unasked one. That's the only bad question ever. All right? Ever. So anything about what's going on at Wellesley, what's going on in the country, what our job here is, why we're here at all. Not everyone at once. Hold your fire. Yeah, please. And sorry, your name again?
Me.
Yeah.
Daniela. I was wondering, I think on like a grand scale, for me it's easy to see like, yeah, we should be able to have conversations with people who disagree with us, like about politics in particular, but it becomes harder when like the politics becomes personal and like on issues that are like very like deeply personal. And how do you manage like a conversation with people who seem like their beliefs is like are directly infringing on like you, basically.
Right, it's so hard. So let's take the example of like, you know, let's say a person who's an immigrant from Central America, and maybe she or he is undocumented, maybe they have family members who are, and you have a kid in class saying, we should build a wall. Okay, so what do you do with that? I would say what you don't do is say, that's a racist comment and don't make it. Because it may well be a racist comment depending on who's talking and who's listening. But that's not going to promote what our job is to promote, which is real discussion and dialogue. Danielle is asking the most important question. What do you do, okay, when somebody's identity feels threatened by the discussion? Okay? I think history is a huge help here, and here's why. Friends, every important statement threatens something fundamental to us. If it didn't, it wouldn't be important. So let me give you an example. I don't know if you've heard the name Mary Beth Tinker, but you should have. Mary Beth Tinker was 13 years old in 1965 when she wore a black armband to her middle school in Des Moines, Iowa. The teacher sent her home, okay, and she and her family lawyered up, and 4 years later, this became the case of Tinker v. Des Moines, in which the Supreme Court said that students and teachers don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, and Mary Beth Tinker had the right to wear that. Mary Beth Tinker isn't that much older than I am, and she's become a friend, and believe it or not, I can't believe I'm even saying this, I'm writing her biography, which is just, it's going to be called Freedom's Daughter. And it's not going to be about the armband case, it's about what she's done since then, how she's made sense of it. What does it mean to be a symbol of something like free speech? She comes up to speak to my students on Danielle's question, all right? And the students say, look, you were fighting the good fight. You were fighting the war in Vietnam. This Milo Yiannopoulos clown, this Ann Coulter, ... all they do is harm people and their identities. We can't allow that. Mary Beth Tinker wasn't having it. This is what she said. She said, look, at my middle school in Des Moines, there were kids who had fathers and brothers who were fighting and dying in Southeast Asia. Do you think they weren't harmed and injured and offended by this snot-nosed 8th grader wearing the symbol saying that their loved ones were going to die for a lie? You don't think that hurt them? Then you're not thinking. Of course it did. That's what made it meaningful. And when hurt becomes the rubric by which we judge all this, we are done, man. We are done. All right? So I think acknowledging the hurt is the key here. All right? But not letting the hurt be the standard by which we decide if we can speak or not. Not willing away or pretending about the hurt. Right? Is that undocumented kid going to be hurt by the wall comment? Yes. Let's say it. But not use it to cut ourselves off from each other. It's really hard, and this is a great question, because one way of thinking about this is, unfortunately, discussion has become a kind of privilege that people like you and me get because of the institutions that we're lucky enough to patronize. It's a sobering idea, right? And it has huge implications for our democracy. And so, let me just say a few things. I would say that it's true that in a private institution like this one, there's much more opportunity for discussion. But in some ways, I think, sometimes, there are more threats to it as well. Because everyone knows each other. And everyone can get canceled by each other super easily. I do think in some ways, sometimes there's actually an advantage, the anonymity of a larger place, right? Because everyone doesn't know you and your friends and who you've dated or whatever, right? The second thing that I would say is that the large universities are often public universities, and they're actually bound by the Constitution in ways that Wellesley isn't, right? If Wellesley wanted to kick out that kid who made the wall comment, it could. And there have been episodes of that around the country. It would be really hard for Penn State to do that. Why? Because Penn State is a public institution and it's bound by the free speech rules of the Constitution. And just to be clear, friends, everyone should know this. They don't have to like it, but they should know it. Hate speech is protected by the Constitution. If you want to argue that it shouldn't be, that's cool, and I think that's a really interesting discussion. But I gave a talk at a law school the other day where a law student got up and said, well, of course, hate speech isn't protected by the First Amendment. I was like, dude, that's like saying 1 and 1 is 3, all right? If you want to say hate speech shouldn't be protected by the Constitution, cool, we'll talk. But you can't say, you can, it's just you'll be wrong, right, if you say it isn't. And why? Because the courts have said that, we don't want to put the federal government in the position of deciding what's hateful or not. And I agree with that, right? Because, yes, Maya Yiannopoulos has said some things that I think are incredibly hateful, and I think most reasonable people would agree with me on that. But other people might say that if I said I'm opposed to affirmative action, that's hateful. Because there are people in the room who may have been beneficiaries of affirmative action, and I'm hating on them. So where does that start? What great God in the sky is going to decide what's hateful and what isn't? So there are also advantages to being at a big public place. But I think at the end of the day, what this is really about is figuring out ways to enhance the value and status of teaching. That's really what it's about. Friends, the great story, the great story of the modern university is that the research function has been professionalized and teaching remains amateur. This is why my next book is called The Amateur Hour, and it's a history of college teaching in America. Why are we amateurs? Not because we're all bad, because amateurs can be incredibly good, all right? It's amateur because it's not regulated or even discussed in the ways that research is. So the book that you've got, how did I get that into print? it was circulated to a bunch of other academics who had to read it and evaluate it. All right, that's what professions do, right? They create standards, right? And they try to evaluate people and even rank them and credential them according to those standards. Teaching, I was at NYU for 20 years. I was observed once by somebody with power. I've been at Penn for 4 years. None! 0! Now, obviously, there's differences across institutions, because here at Wellesley, that would never happen, right? I'm sure of it. One of my daughters went to Claremont McKenna out in California, and there, it wasn't just you got observed. After your student evals, somebody not from your department who had been trained to do this, a fellow faculty not from your department, would read your evals and then conduct a focus group with your students based on the evals and write a report of the focus group. And that goes into your file. Should we be surprised that they took teaching pretty seriously there? I don't. Our other daughter went to Columbia, and the difference in the quality of teaching on the average was just massive, chasm-like. Obviously, there's going to be variation at every institution, but the variation at Claremont McKenna was so much smaller. At an institution like that, or this one, you just can't blow off your students. Everyone would know, right? Like, you know, it's one little bubble, right? So, you know, at Columbia, our older daughter, you know, she had some stuff that was really good, but then some stuff that was appalling. And incidentally, if you do what I do for a living, if somebody who's 20 talks to you about a class for 10 minutes, like, you can render a judgment, right? I mean, it's like, is the professor engaged? Do the assignments reflect consistent themes? Does the professor return work? Does she make herself available? And, you know, it's not rocket science, you know. But the point is, we don't value it professionally, you know, at most institutions. And until we do, it's pretty hard for me to see how we're really going to create a different environment for discussion, because if you don't care about teaching, you're not going to care about discussion. And it's the indoctrination question. It's a huge question. And for me, it starts and ends with a guy who I think is the most important philosopher that Americans know the least about, whose name was Alexander Meiklejohn. Nobody reads him anymore, unfortunately. Meiklejohn. But Meiklejohn was president of Amherst briefly before the alumni drummed him out because they didn't like what he was doing there. He ended up at Wisconsin, where he started this experimental college. What's the difference between teaching and indoctrination? Here's what he said. He said, look, your job as a teacher is not to get the students to share your perspective. Your job is to help them develop their perspective, which may end up looking like yours and may not. So how do you do that? How do you do it? Well, here's what Meiklejohn said, and this is the part where it gets very complicated. He said, don't pretend you're above it all. Okay? So don't say, oh, the war in Afghanistan just came up, I can't talk about that because I'm some Olympian figure living over the fray. He said, no, you're a political actor in your own right. And more than that, how are they going to learn how to do politics if you pretend you're not political? His famous formulation was, slaves can't teach freedom. He's like, how are you going to exhibit these dialogical capacities if you pretend that you're not part of the dialogue? So he actually thought that teachers, including at the Friends School, should say what they think about the war in Iraq and everything else. But in the same breath, and this is where it gets really hard, they have to make it absolutely clear that it is just their perspective and that the people in the room are not required to share it. But that's hard because you're the adult in the room, right? You're grading people, you know. You have an enormous amount of power. Right? And a student once facetiously told me that, everyone here says that the only way to get a good grade in your class is by contradicting you. You can err on that side too. I mean, I put such an emphasis on this with my students. I'm like, look, I'm not here to create 30 new Jonathan Zimmermans. That is not my jam, right? The world is doing like fine with one, and the idea of more than that is sort of frightening. All right, so that's not my thing. I'm here to help you discover you, right? So you are not enjoined to agree with a single thing that I said. Your only job is to analyze what I said and decide what you think, right? Not to mimic or echo me. But that's really hard, especially at the high school levels. And I would add, especially when it seems like everyone kind of agrees with each other. It's like, oh yes, yes, I hate Trump too. Right? Yawn. Like, who learns from that? Who learns from it? I don't. I rarely learn from anybody that I agree with, right? If I went to the gym and just watched MSNBC, I would learn, like 20% of what I learned from watching Fox News, right? I mean, it would be more pleasurable, but it would just be, yep, right, check, got it, yeah, right, that nod. I call it the Penn nod, because I work at Penn now. Because everyone, somebody says I hate Trump, and everyone goes, not learning anything, just nodding. Yeah. A question, yes, sorry, your name again?
Rula.
Again?
Rula.
Rula, yeah.
So basically with the rising polarization, issues become more personal because of hyperpartisanship, and we lose empathy in conversations. Do you ever see us emerging from this competitive nature, or have we just completely forfeited the ability to compromise?
Oh, God. Rula, could you ask a bigger question with wider implications? I don't want any narrow, picayune stuff here. I mean, look, this isn't just the question of the day, this is the question of the hour. This is the question, Rula is asking the existential question for all of us, right now, this day. All right? This is it, man. This is the whole kahuna, everything. And if you go to USA Today, don't do it now, but if you have a spare moment, you'll see that there's an editorial by Jonathan Zimmerman today, all right, on Rula's question. Right now, today. And here's what it is, all right? And this is going to be a long-winded way of answering Rula's question. I do think there's a way through this, and here's what it is. Look. Whenever a controversial issue arises in my class, of course, like Michael John, I make it clear that nobody has to agree with me or with each other. But then I say something else. For us to have a discussion on this issue, whatever it is, abortion, capital punishment, gun control, you're going to have to identify and specify what evidence or arguments would make you change your mind. If you can't, we're done talking. What's the point, right? What is the point? You have to be able to imagine something that would sway you, all right? And if you can't, it's cool. You have a right to your belief, but you believe it like a religion, which is cool too. I'm into religion, all right? But it's just we're not going to have a discussion or deliberation about it because your mind is closed. So you have to specify or imagine what evidence would actually start to sway you on this. So let's talk impeachment. All right? I've written other columns about this where I've taken people like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham to task. I also yield to nobody in my loathing of them. Why? Because in December, both of them said that their minds were made up. And Lindsey Graham went to Qatar and said, I'm not an impartial juror. And yet, last Thursday, Lindsey Graham walked into the Senate and took an oath to be an impartial juror. He is a martinet for Trump and a liar. He's already violated his oath. He said he's not going to be an impartial juror. And then he took an oath saying that he would be. McConnell too. But, and this comes back to my classroom thing. Are the people on my team impartial? Are they living up to their oath? And I would say the answer is no, unless they can specify what evidence could emerge in the trial they could imagine that would change their mind. And so in the piece, I tried to do that. I tried to imagine things that could emerge in the trial that would change my mind, okay? And here's what I wrote. I said, look, on the question of whether Trump withheld aid in order to put pressure on Ukraine to dig up dirt on the Bidens, my mind is closed. I don't think that's a question anymore. To me, that's like, do vaccines cause autism? All right? I know there are millions of people that are denying it, but the evidence is overwhelming. And indeed, the whole reason the Republicans are trying to keep out more evidence about that subject is they know it too. That train has left the station. Okay? There's nothing that could convince me that that didn't happen. But is it enough to remove him? And on that, I said, my mind does remain open. It's closed on the facts, right? This is what happened, all right? Okay? What I just described is what happened. You don't know all the details, but we'll know more soon. All right? That's done. But that's a fact question. And the question of whether this is enough to remove him is a values question. So what would change my mind on that? Here are three things. If somebody could persuade me that removing Trump will trigger an infinite regress of impeachments, whereby whenever there's a new president, the other team doesn't like what he or she is doing because the other team never does, and they impeach him. All right? I'm not saying that's going to happen. All right? But I'm saying that if somebody could convince me that it would happen, that would definitely alter my view on removing Trump. Secondly, if somebody could convince me that removing Trump would hamper the ability of future presidents to conduct foreign policy, right? We do want our presidents to have leeway in the conduct of foreign policy, all right? If somebody could convince me that removing Trump will make it harder for future presidents to conduct foreign policy. And then third, if somebody could convince me that this doesn't rise to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor, all right? Look, as of right now, I support the removal of Donald Trump strongly, okay? But the trial just started. And if any of those three things could convince me, if I saw reason to believe any of those three things, if the Republicans or anybody else introduced arguments and evidence, all right, I could be swayed in that. High crimes and misdemeanors, look, what Alan Dershowitz is saying is ridiculous. All right, the idea that since the beginning this has only been applied to people who committed crimes. In fact, the founding fathers said the opposite. All right, and Alexander Hamilton, of all people, all right, wrote explicitly on this, and he's like, look, it's not just going to be restricted to people that committed crimes. Okay, that's actually too narrow a restriction, and it's got to be people who've done something horrible to the public or to the common weal. And yet, isn't that exactly the sort of original intent argument that my team doesn't like when we're talking about things like abortion rights? Like, the First Amendment doesn't mention a right to abortion. Okay? It doesn't, by the way. Republicans are right about that. But my team says, well, yes, but it's a living constitution. All right? Its interpretation should change over time. And we think that now, in 2020, the First and the 14th Amendments apply to a right to abortion. And by the way, I agree with all that. All right? Strongly. So maybe somebody could convince me that even though Dershowitz is wrong about original intent, and the original intent wasn't restricted to people who've committed crimes, maybe we should restrict it that way now. I'll listen. And if I don't, I'm no better than McConnell or Graham. I'm just a martinet like that. So the answer to Rula's question is, all of us have to scrutinize what we think instead of just lashing out at the next person. And this is where education comes in. This was even Michael John's point, right? Not taking things on faith, not just nodding, all right? Not saying, yes, I hate Trump too, but asking yourself and teaching other people to ask themselves, what would change your mind? What would change your mind? what would change your mind? And I read everything now with that front and center. Sorry, your name?
Hira.
Hira.
I was just wondering, in high school, I took AP Human Geography, which is probably the easiest AP you can take, but I actually ended up
Mazel
learning a lot.
Yeah.
And we were...
Where was this, sorry?
AP Human Geography.
I know, but where?
Academy of the Holy Names in Tampa, Florida.
All right.
All-girls Catholic school.
Yeah.
And I'm Muslim, so...
Wow.
Anyway, so we were talking about how the trend is as people, pursue higher education and they pursue a grad degree and go into postdoctoral stuff, they end up leaning more liberal when they might have grown up around conservative parents and adopted their views, and then once they reach this higher education, their views changed. And you've mentioned at the beginning of your talk how the more educated you are, the less likely you are to have friends of different political views.
Or lovers, by the way.
Or lovers, sure.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about how that plays a role in people this might come with the understanding that maybe the liberal point of view is right, but how does that work when it comes to people who simply have figured out in their own way that the liberal point of view is one that they agree with fundamentally, whereas previously maybe that wasn't the case beforehand, and now because they're surrounded by more educated people as they're pursuing degrees, it's normal and that's how it should happen. Am I making any sort of sense?
But why should it happen?
Because
it does happen.
Right, it does happen, but it's maybe they've realized that they want nothing to do with a view that they have decided to be incorrect or offensive, perhaps.
Right. Look, I guess it's a complicated question because I liked your little parenthetical. You said, well, maybe this implies that the liberal view is the right view. All of us think we're right. Right?
Right.
The question though is, how can we keep space for the possibility that we're wrong? I'm not saying don't think you're right. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. We all do, right? I think the hard part is finding things where you, how can I say this, where the issue is so fundamental to you that you can't entertain the other side, right? Find out where your non-negotiables are, right? But don't just take them on faith. Find out. So, the things that make you angry are often your non-negotiables. So I'll give you an example. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, and I'm delighted to say that we have two Nepalis here. Jai Desh, Jai Nepal, that means long live Nepal. One of the most remarkable experiences I had, I taught in a village that was 3 days from vehicular traffic. So I had to go down to the tribe, which is the plains area that between India and Nepal, go west for 150K and then walk into the mountains for 3 days. I was the first white person that people had ever seen in my district, and they thought I was a ghost. They would say bhoot, which is the Nepali name for ghost. Anyway, I taught there for 2.5 years, and 15 years later, I look at my phone and somebody's calling from Akron, Ohio. And I was gonna not answer it, just figuring it was a robocall, but I'm really glad that I didn't. And I pick up, and the guy says, "Jun, sir?" And I immediately knew it was somebody I taught in Nepal, because where else was I called Jun, sir? And it was Govinda. It was this kid I had taught in Nepal. And, the part of Nepal I was in, maybe 2 or 3 people would leave to go to university each year. And Govinda was Egnam Chalak, which means very clever, and I wasn't surprised that he was one of those people. And he told me an amazing story. He goes to university for two years to get what in Nepal is called an AA, and then he's posted somewhere in the tribe, down in the plains, at a school where there was a female Peace Corps volunteer. You know where this is going. Talk about a melting pot, all right? And they fell in love. And they came to visit us from Akron, Lynn and Govinda. And Lynn told me that the first thing that he ever said to her was, "Hello, miss. Do you know John Zimmerman?" Which is one of the great pickup lines in human history, isn't it? It's like, "Do you come here often? Haven't we met before? Do you know John Zimmerman?" Right? And look, it worked, right? I mean, proof is in the pudding. Anyway, they come to visit, and I say to Govinda, my Nepali used to be really good, and now it's bad, and so we had to go into English, and I said, "Why didn't you call me when you came to America?" Because now it had been like 10 years. And he said, "I thought you'd be angry with me. You're angry with me." And I'm like, "Huh?" And then, to the point of what's non-negotiable and not, he told the following story, of which I had, of course, no memory. All right? In Nepal, like a synagogue I attended as a kid, the boys and girls were on different sides. This is very common throughout the world, right? Even in coeducational settings, they sit on different sides. And there were no blackboards in Bhutan, Nepal at this point, so what I would do is I'd put charcoal on pieces of wood, and with a rock, I would write on it. And it worked, all right? And I had one for the boys and one for the girls. And in Govinda's telling, they're comping down the assignment for the night. And Govinda got up and started erasing the girls' side. And he said I lit into him. And I yelled at him, and people all around the school could hear me. I don't yell at people, all right? Like, I just don't. And I couldn't believe this story. But he said, in Nepali, I said to him, like, you know, this is sinful. Like, what you're doing is sinful. I said, you know, these girls, they have the same right to learn as you do, right? And to hear his point, there would be nothing Govinda could have said that would have persuaded me otherwise. On the question of whether girls and boys have the same right to learn, I'm not talking. I mean, you know, if you don't believe me or if you don't agree with that, again, that's your right. But there's nothing that Govinda could have said to me or that anyone could say to me. I understand they do not empirically have the same right, okay, around the world. But if the question is, just as a moral question, should girls and boys have the same right to an education, I don't find it an interesting question. It's interesting how we might operationalize that. It's interesting to think about why it doesn't exist. And again, we can all disagree about that. We also can disagree about whether girls and boys should have the same education, but I'm not interested in the same right to an education. I'm not interested in having that discussion because I don't consider it a discussion at all. So I think finding the places where you have non-negotiables and just copping to that, all right? But being as reflective, as honest as you are about that, and make sure it's a real non-negotiable. So I feel very passionate about gun control, but if somebody could actually show me that having more guns, or like allowing people to carry them like at, you know, universities. I laugh because I know our Nepali friends are from Texas, and one of the big things that happened in Texas was like the State House decided that, you know, professors and students should be allowed to, you know, carry a gun. So now whenever I go to a faculty meeting, I'm like packing heat. You know, I mean, you never know what those professors are going to do, you know. No, again, I find this ridiculous. I won't deny it. But again, if somebody could show me that like arming everybody could actually reduce the amount of gun violence in this country, I would sign up for arming people. I absolutely would. That's an empirical question, right? But there's no analog to that for me in the question of rights for girls and boys. Other things. I know that I know I saw Danielle and then Lula again.
I was wondering, you mentioned how we're kind of self-segregating in terms of ideology, and I mean, I live in New York City. It's very clear to me. Out of our 51
91% Hillary.
Yeah, I mean, our city council has 51 seats, and there are only 3 Republicans. And
they're from Staten Island.
2 from Staten Island, 1 from Queens.
Queens, yeah.
But yeah, so it's like I remember when I was 6 at school, I'd ask people if their parents were voting for Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, but it never occurred to me to ask if their parents were voting for the Democrats
That was the only election.
or for the Republicans.
Exactly, yeah,
That, I don't know. And that
What other election was there?
That wasn't a debate in my mind. Not that I really
Right.
was thinking. I don't know. I didn't really understand what was going on,
Right.
but I do know that like my mom was making a decision in that election,
Right.
not in the other one.
Right.
So how and I think this became even more clear in high school when like I started thinking about politics, and like I was working in New York City politics too, and I realized like some of my mom's friends in Miami are Republicans, but like very few like day-to-day interactions with them. How do you foster like those conversations with people that disagree with you if like the big disagreements that like exist in the country aren't like you're not actually having them with people because
Right.
the people around you don't believe those things?
Look, that one I can answer. The first thing that you need to do is just inform yourself about them, right? It seems to me what Danielle is describing is actually a system of ignorance, right? It's not her fault, right? But it's a structure of ignorance, right? You create an environment where you are not exposed to things that aren't you. That makes you ignorant, right? Of things that aren't you. And so all of us actually have the capacity to do that. The question is whether we have the will, right? And I think that's the issue. I have a love-hate relationship with the internet, and there's no question that the internet has had a huge role in fueling all this polarization and hate, but it also represents an amazing solvent if we want it to, right? Because it's all there at our fingertips. And I'm kind of a self-hating academician, if you haven't noticed. I love my job, but I'm not, most of my close friends are not college professors, I'll be honest. I have former students that are very good friends now, but not professors. I find professors pretty close-minded, pretty dull, predictable. And that's why I write for the popular press. Why do I write for USA Today? Like, for the $75 honorarium? No. All right? Because it's going to be a great data point on my CV? No. When I started as an academician, a lot of senior people told me not to write for the public press. It'll make you look like a thin scholar. Like, if any average Joe or Joe S can understand what you're saying, how important could it be, really? Here's why I do it. It gives me a set of interlocutors that aren't like me or Danielle, right? If I write for an academic journal, everyone there is like me. Every single person. And look, again, I've tried to be as transparent about who I am. Check it out. Like, my dad was in the Peace Corps. He knew the Kennedys. That's who hired him. I was in the Peace Corps. Like, I'm a professor. I'm Jewish. I'm like the most hilarious caricature of a liberal Democrat they could be. I'm a cartoon. All right? But if I didn't write for the popular press, I would just be surrounded by other cartoons. And I would think that that's reality rather than a cartoon. So, I'll go onto the response page from USA Today, and I'll look in my email, which gets filled up, and there are a lot of people that don't agree with me, and they become like my email friends. I don't respond to all of them because I can't, and also because some of it is whacked. Right? It just is. Or Jew-hating. That's there too, right? If you have a Jewish last name, people will write shit on you. I'm not surprised that a person named Zimmerman would think this, why don't you go back to Israel, right? I got that last week, And when I used to do a lot of talk radio. That shouldn't surprise you either. And, when I was younger, sometimes people would call in and they would say, now Zimmerman, what kind of name is that? And I didn't really get it when I was younger. I would say, it's Jehovah's Witness, motherfucker. Why are you even asking? Why don't you just go under the anti-Semitic rock from which you came, right? But when you did that, then the switchboard would light up, right? With all these other people, because it's pornography for them, right? That's exactly what the Jewish guy's getting cornered, right? Oh, this is good, right? And so now I just say, I don't think that's a relevant question. you know? So look, some of it is whack, some of it is awful, right? But some of it is smart. And you're like, holy shit, I never thought of that. And you know why I haven't thought of that? Because I'm surrounded by people that think like me. That's the reason I haven't thought of it, you know? And you know, I've now become somewhat expert at reading these emails, and I can tell if it's going to be whack within the first 2 sentences. And like the whack people, it's all, like they all went to the same school. Like one of them begins, I thought people who teach at an Ivy League institution, da da da, and it's like must know their ass from their elbow, right? I thought people that teach at an Ivy League institution, it's like there was some school where everyone learned to do that. And as soon as you say it, you're like deleted, right? But then some of the other stuff, it's like, wow, you know, that's a really interesting point. And it's an interesting point that I would never have been exposed to if I just remained within either my institutional or my media cocoon. I would have never seen it. So we have the power to do this, right? All of us do. The question is, again, whether we have the will and how you can organize a political project around that, right? Where's the protest sign? People for debating the other side. More dialogue. Like, it generally doesn't work that way. It's like, my team rocks and yours sucks. My team rocks and yours suck, right? I mean, that's what it is, all right? So how do you make a movement for dialogue across movements? That, I would submit to you, is the most urgent question of the day. I wish I knew the answer. Question China? Your question, do you know now? Yeah.
So I had a question, kind of what you were just talking about how you kind of go about meeting people with different opinions from you. Just because I feel like places like Wellesley and like my friends, they tend to be kind of like a bubble, you know. And how do you leave that bubble and meet other people with opinions that are different from you?
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing. The bubble actually isn't as bubbly as we think, because so many people are self-censoring, right? Even the metaphor of the bubble is part of the problem in a way. And again, I'm not criticizing you for using it, because I use it too, right? But in some ways, the metaphor of the bubble becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, right? So my strong guess is that at Wellesley, to take the example of earlier, there are students that don't think it's a very good idea to use race and ethnicity in college admissions. And I bet they're sitting next to you somewhere. It's just you don't know who they are, right? Because they're in the closet, you know? And I think that the thing is trying to make, and this in some ways we ask the question, trying to make an environment where we can come out. And I'm using this metaphor, by the way, willfully and by design, because a lot of people on the right use it. So there's a book about Republican professors by a friend of mine called Passing on the Right, and even there you see passing, you can see the metaphors. And a lot of the Republicans use the language of the gay rights movement because it resonates with them. This idea, you talk to people, especially in prior generations that grew up gay or lesbian, and they talk about like going along in a smiling way, pretending, you know, and then finally finding their freedom in their voice, generally after tenure, right? And that's what a lot of Republicans, there aren't that many, but that's what they do, right? In the early stages, you certainly don't want people to think that you vote Republican because that might affect your career choice. You go, it's just like, yes, of course I'm straight when in fact I'm gay, but I'll pretend, right? And then you come out. And I've had a couple Trump voters in my office over the years. They do exist at Penn, but they are deep in the closet. And I'm like, come out, it gets better, just be yourself, like don't live a lie. I mean, that's really what I'm saying, and I get what they're saying, and again, it is a good analogy. They're like, easy for you to say, buddy. Like, you know, you don't have to deal with the bullying and the hatred that I have to deal with, right? I mean, how as a straight person can I say to a gay person, hey, come out of the closet? I mean, I know gay people do that, right? And I know it's a whole lot easier now than it used to be, but again, that's going to vary based on where you live, right? And faith community and everything like that, right? And so I get it, you know, but I think, you know, what all of us have to do, faculty and students, is encourage people to say what they think, no matter what it is. Like, I want to hear it. I'm not going to tell you I'll necessarily agree with it, all right, because I can't say that. All I can say is I want to hear it. I want to hear you, whatever it is, whatever it is. And again, we can do that. We can do it. You know, I think it does involve standing up to some bullies. You know, I think there's a lot of bullying in this zone. And it's ironic because some of those people are also like part of anti-bullying like initiatives. It's like, I'm a part of an anti-bully initiative, but I'm going to bully you if you disagree with the anti-bully initiative. No, it doesn't really work for me. You know, and you know, I think that when you look at the social science around questions like this, you often find that because of the bubble metaphor, people exaggerate the degree of unanimity. My favorite set of statistics are when we take high school students and we ask, for example, what fraction of juniors or seniors have had sex? The kids exaggerate the reality by like 40%. So the kids will say 80% and the answer is 40%. Right? Because everyone's doing it, of course. Actually, no. Right? Drug and alcohol, same thing. Right? Like, what fraction of students in this school do you think have had more than 3 drinks on one night? The students will say 80%, the right answer is like 30%. Right? So these are all kind of bubble effects, right? And everyone thinks, well, of course, right? Because that's kind of the most vocal people, right, are on the internet showing them with their red cups. And you're like, everyone's doing it, right? It's like, no, they're not. So you go onto social media at Wellesley, it would be easy to consider that everybody is for Liz or Bernie. Of course they are, because that's who we are. That's who we are at Wellesley, right? Everyone's for Liz or Bernie, and I'm sure there are a lot of people for Liz or Bernie. All right? Not all. Oh no, right? But the ones who like Mayor Pete or Amy Klobuchar are, I'm sure of this, I would bet my last remaining dollar, more reticent about that than the ones who like Liz and Bernie. But that doesn't mean they're not there, right? They're just not talking as loudly. Yeah.
I have a question regarding like facilitating discussions. So as Sunil mentioned earlier, when the politics hit too close to home, when your identity feels politicized, and yet you are still supposed to be having these discussions regardless of people's varying political views, sometimes it can be almost exhausting and it can feel like draining. So do you think it's excusable for people to want to step out of these discussions and be like, you know what, look it up yourself? Because I feel like a lot of people of color and just of diverse backgrounds feel the need to just be like, you know, leave me alone for a second. I shouldn't have to explain everything to you. The internet is literally in your hands. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I get it. It's like another question about my hair.
Yeah.
Really? Like, how many questions am I going to get about my hair? I get it. All right? I would be exhausted as well. And I think it's perfectly fine to say, I'm exhausted. It's perfectly fine to say anything except, I'm never going to talk to you. Saying you're exhausted is not saying, I'm never going to talk to you. It's saying, you know, I've heard this question a few many times and I'm too tired to answer. All right? But let's talk about something else. Right? Or maybe in 3 days when I feel a little less exhausted, I'll tell you why I was exhausted. Right? It's being honest, but leaving space. And those are not inconsistent. Right? If you feel exhausted, say you're exhausted. Right? I mean, again, after a long, perhaps too long plea for people saying what they think, the last thing I would say is, oh, bite your tongue. No way, right? I think you have every right to feel exhausted, all right? But if you use that to say, I'm not going to talk about other things because you've shown me via your hair comment that you're not worth addressing, that's different, all right? And I think these distinctions, I know they're subtle, but they matter, right? So don't bite your tongue, all right, ever, about what you feel. But also, don't create circumstances where you can never remedy precisely the gaps in communication and knowledge that led to the hair question. Yeah, sorry, your name?
Nazan.
Nala?
Nazan.
Nazan, sorry.
So I'm a postdoc here at the Freedom Project.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And where are you from?
Turkey.
Oh, excellent.
So I have a question about the language of psychology and how it gets validated in campus politics and teaching and everything. I had the chance to teach in Turkey too, where none of the students' feelings were validated, yet students were still having them. And here also, how students and everyone else wants to feel validated because they are feeling traumatized. And I'm on the same page with you, about distinguishing between a real trauma and emptying its definition.
Read about what happened to the Armenians and then come back and tell me about trauma.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's there's a real trauma and then there's a feeling, but I also think that maybe the feelings of this generation is real to them because of their generational problems, which is not maybe possible to address in a campus setting, in a learning environment, because there are bigger political and economic problems behind it. They feel precarious. They know that the college degree is not going to be enough for them as it was for the previous generation. So they all have this, general anxiety about everything else. So how are we going to maybe as educators not address those feelings? I mean, teaching them not to be fragile. Okay, that is one thing, but what they feel is real to them.
Right. I mean, it's Nazan, right? I mean, this is a terrific question. I've also written some about this in my Chronicle of Higher Ed columns. And here's what I'd say. First of all, Nazan is exactly right. If you look at reported levels of anxiety, if you look at reported levels of stress, there's no question they've gone up. And look, I have enormous empathy for the members of this generation, and I include my daughters. They're 26 and 23. So, we helped as best we could 2 young adults go through what the other people in this room are going through, and it is not easy. When I graduated from college, before I joined the Peace Corps, I don't remember ever wondering if I would get a job, or God forbid, have to move back with my parents. Friends, I would have rather lived on the median strip in Broadway than move back with my parents. I mean, there was no way, no how, no nothing. And now that's a thing. And I get it, it's not because of anything anybody did. My students are ever more brilliant every year, much more accomplished than I was at that age, but their opportunities are circumscribed in ways that mine were not. This is not an opinion, this is a fact, and you can document it in a million ways. Okay, but, and here's the answer, I think, or not the answer, an answer. Here too, our universities have not done themselves proud in addressing this crisis. Why? Because in many ways they've ginned it up, they've accelerated it, rather than tuning it down. Let me just give you some concrete examples. Where I work at the University of Pennsylvania, almost all the clubs require applications and interviews. So a student last year, and this inspired one of my columns, said that she wanted to join the Alzheimer's Buddies Club, which is a club that brings students to visit Alzheimer's patients, but she didn't get in. And I'm like, whoa, time out. You didn't get in? What was the process for getting in? And she said, well, first you had to write an essay about all your beneficent and munificent impulses and reasons that you want to be in the Alzheimer's Buddies Club. And then you have to have an interview with one of the officers in the club, some pisher in a skirt or a tie, pretending to be a grown-up interviewing you. Fuck that, right? I will have none of that. If I were king, and this will never happen, all right, this is the way it would go down. Anyone who wants to be in the Alzheimer's Buddies Club signs up. And if, in fact, the van only holds 12 people, all right, among the 20 that applied, we would randomize. We can do that. We can do it. This is totally within our power. But we don't. So we take students who've already run that terrible admissions gauntlet that you already ran. All right? Kill or be killed, only the strong survive. And then we create an environment that recapitulates that. We don't have to do it, but we do. And friends, here's the darkest thing of all. I mean, this is so dark I can like barely say it. When I showed this con to my students, several of them said, look, Professor, that's a nice idea, but if we did it your way, nobody would ever want to be in the Alzheimer's Buddies Club. This is as dark as it gets. Think about this, or don't, because it'll be too depressing. All right? All that munificent, beneficent stuff that you had to express in your essay is bullshit, is cynical bullshit. All right? And the only reason you do this is because it's selective. That which is selective is valuable, that which is not valuable. This is what we've taught people. We don't have to do it. We don't have to do it. All right? None of this was handed down from Mount Sinai. This is all stuff that human beings made, and they can change. Even the admissions thing. Like, again, this will never happen, but if I were king, I mean, this is the way it would work. Every institution, including Wellesley, would create a bar. All right? And at Wellesley, the bars can be pretty damn high. All right? And the bar will contain, you know, a lot of the elements you're familiar with, right? Some grades, some test scores, okay? Some number that indicates, you know, an admission director's view of your essay and, you know, your extracurriculars. Maybe we'll change the bar a little bit if there are certain groups, underprivileged groups, underrepresented groups that we want. But ultimately, okay, there'll be a bar, and there will be more people over the bar than Wellesley can admit. No? All right? And then what will we do with those people? We'll randomize. Yes, we will. It's still meritocratic, right? The bar is still high, and it's going to be damn hard to get over it. But instead of pretending, which is what we do now, that if Wellesley's taking 1,200 kids, kid 1,200 is better than kid 1,201, friends, that's not a myth, that's a lie. It simply cannot be true. It cannot be true that kid 1,200 is better in any way that you can make sense of that word than 1,201. So we do away with that, right? There are a whole bunch of terrific kids. They all had to bust their butts to get over the bar, and we'll randomize among them. Then nobody will think that they were worse. They will know that it was both meritocratic, right? Which it was, and it involved an element of chance, which everything does. Which everything does. Except for me, okay? I was a very good fetus. I really was, right? I didn't just sit there sucking on the teat of the nanny state. I pulled myself up by my umbilical cord, all right? And I just, you know, and I earned like parents who loved and cared for me and took me all over the world, all right? I earned all of it, all right? It was proactive on my part. It really was, right? I didn't have to get born in one of those shitty countries you got to live on $1 a day, right? Fuck that, all right? It was just, you know, I planned it out, all right? And I earned all of it, right? That's the lie that we teach. Friends, all of you earned your way here, and all of you got lucky. Both those things. They're not mutually inconsistent. They're co-joined. But when we teach people only to look at the merit part and forget about the luck part, we set them up for all kinds of failure and self-hatred. All right? Because then when something doesn't go your way, it's only because of you. All right? So look, if you apply for a fellowship or for a job and you don't get it, your friends or your lovers, if they love you, they'll say, look, don't take it personally. Like, you don't know what else was in the mix. You don't know what else was going on. That's all true. But then you hit the number, and what do they say? Mazel tov, you earned it. This is a contradiction a third grader could see through, right? If luck operated when you got dinged, surely luck operated when you hit the number. This is just logic, man, right? But we've created systems that deny logic and that actually fuel and exacerbate the anxiety that's already there. We don't have to do it. We just do, but we don't have to.
All right. So Dr. Zimmerman has to fly to the airport in about 15 minutes. So we have to end here. But thank you so much.
Looking forward to dining together, and this is not the end of a conversation. This is the beginning of one. And I hope on your walk, if there's anything that I can do to help you out, that you will let me know. So thanks a lot.